The HOA burned my lake mansion to the ground, all over $680 in fake fees. They turned the memorial retreat I built with my own hands for Gold Star families into nothing but a pile of ash. The HOA president, Karen, thought she had won. She stood there with a forged court order, called me a squatter, and believed she had destroyed my life. But she made one fatal mistake. She thought our fight was over, but she had no idea that the next time she'd see a judge, she would be the one in handcuffs, standing in my courtroom for her own sentencing. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments because this story of takedown justice is insane. And if you believe no HOA should have the power to burn a person's life to the ground, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when they finally get what they deserve. The smell is what I'll never forget. It's not the same as a normal fire. A house fire is hot, acrid, a chaotic mix of burning plastic, wood, and life. This was different. It smelled cold, wet ash, mixed with the damp pine scent from the surrounding woods. It was the smell of a purpose-built ending, clean and final. I stood there, boots sinking slightly into the soggy black earth that used to be my living room, and just looked. The chimney stood like a tombstone, a lonely brick finger pointing at a gray sky. Everything else was gone. My lake house, the one Sarah and I designed on 100 napkins at a diner downtown, was a charcoal drawing smudged into the ground. I'd been a firefighter for 30 years and an Army engineer before that. I knew what fire did. I knew its language, its hunger. But this wasn't a wildfire or a faulty wire. This was an execution. I walked the perimeter, my boots crunching on what was left. Glass melted into strange, milky shapes. The twisted metal frame of the bed where my wife took her last breath. I felt a cold knot tighten in my gut, but the tears wouldn't come. Grief was an old friend, and this felt more like a violation. Deeper in the debris, near where the fireplace hearth should have been, I saw it. A glint of gold. I knelt and dug through the soot with my bare hands, the grit scraping my knuckles. It was a picture frame, its edges melted but the glass somehow intact. Inside, Sarah was smiling, leaning against the front porch railing the day we finished it. Her hair was still long then, before the cancer. She was so proud of this place. This was supposed to be her legacy. I was still holding the picture when the county fire marshal's truck rolled up the long gravel driveway. A man I knew, Bill, stepped out. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He just looked at his clipboard, then at the house, then back at his clipboard. He cleared his throat. "Mike," he said, his voice flat. "Official report says this was a controlled demolition and burn. Authorized." I stared at him, trying to make the words fit together. They wouldn't. "Authorized by who, Bill? I was gone for 2 days." He finally looked at me, a flicker of something, pity, maybe shame, in his eyes before it was gone. "The Homeowners Association. They filed a writ of abatement, said the property was abandoned and in violation of covenants." I just shook my head. Abandoned? I lived here. I had just finished the last of the restorations, a project I'd poured my soul into for 2 years. "Violation of what?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Bill flipped a page on his clipboard. "The report cites multiple unresolved violations and unpaid fees, totaling $680. $680. They had burned my life to the ground for less than the cost of a new television. I had never received a bill, not one. I paid my property taxes, my utilities, everything. I never even knew there were HOA fees on my lot. My grandfather bought this land 60 years ago, long before any HOA existed. The worst part, the part that felt like a physical blow, was that this week was supposed to be the beginning. I had finally finished converting the house. It was going to be called the Haven House, a free retreat for Gold Star families, men and women who had lost a spouse or a child in the service. A quiet place on the lake to heal. I'd spent my retirement savings, called in favors from every contractor I knew, and worked until my hands bled to get it ready. The first 2 families were due to arrive on Friday. I had their pictures on the fridge, 2 young widows with kids who needed to remember what quiet felt like. Now, what was I supposed to tell them? "I'm sorry. The place where you were supposed to find some peace was torched by a neighborhood committee over a fake bill?" The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. How do you rebuild a home for people whose lives were shattered by war, when the ones who burned it down are still in charge of the neighborhood? It felt impossible, a joke with no punchline. It all started a year ago, with a single piece of paper taped to my front door. Before that, the HOA was just a name on a sign at the entrance to the development, a group that handled landscaping for the common areas. Nobody bothered you. Then Karen Delancey got elected president. She was a former realtor who moved in a few years back, a woman who walked around with a clipboard and a smile that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. She seemed to thrive on finding problems where there were none. Her personal vendetta was against anyone who wasn't compliant, which really meant anyone who had been here longer than her and didn't care about her made-up rules. The notice on my door was polite but firm, printed on thick letterhead. It said my dock was 12 inches too long per a bylaw passed the month before. It was the same dock my father and I built 20 years ago. The first shot in a war I didn't even know I was supposed to be fighting. That first letter about the dock was just the beginning, the first match struck in a dry field. A week later, another one came, certified mail this time. A $50 fine for unapproved roofing shingles. I had just replaced the roof myself, using architectural shingles that were rated for a 100-mile-an-hour wind, the best you could get. I'd even used the same color as the old ones. The letter said I needed to submit a sample for approval. I sent them an email with the product specs, the receipt, and a polite note explaining the work. I got no response. A month later, another letter arrived. The fine had doubled to $100 for non-compliance. Then came another for the unauthorized alteration of shoreline landscaping because I'd pulled some overgrown weeds from around the dock stairs. The fines kept coming, one after another, like a steady, deliberate drumbeat. It felt less like rule enforcement and more like harassment. I decided to go to the next HOA meeting to sort this out like a reasonable person. The meeting was in the clubhouse, a sterile room with folding chairs and a cheap linoleum floor. Karen Delancey sat at the head of a long table, flanked by two other board members who looked like they'd been picked for their ability to nod on cue. I waited my turn, then calmly explained my situation. I showed them my property survey, which clearly indicated my land was an original plat, recorded decades before the HOA was ever formed. I wasn't technically under their jurisdiction for these kinds of architectural rules. I was polite. I was clear. Karen listened with a tight, patient smile, the kind a person uses when they're just waiting for you to stop talking. When I was done, she didn't look at my papers. She looked out at the 10 or so other residents in the room, her voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Halley," she began, "while we appreciate your history lesson, the fact remains that you benefit from the services our HOA provides, the landscaped entrance, the road maintenance, the property values we protect. You can't just opt out of the rules you don't like." She then turned her attention fully to the room. "What we have here is someone who enjoys all the benefits of a luxury lakefront community, but feels he is above the responsibilities." She paused for effect, letting her words hang in the air. "Frankly, we have rules to prevent squatters from bringing down the character of our neighborhood, even if they happen to be squatting in a luxury lot." The room went silent. A few people shuffled in their seats, uncomfortable. Squatter. The word hit me like a physical slap. I had built that house. I had poured my life into that land. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice low and even. "I am not a squatter, and I will not be paying fines for phantom violations on my own property." I gathered my papers and walked out, the heat of humiliation crawling up my neck. I sent a formal, notarized letter of objection the next day citing the property records and a complete lack of any signed covenant agreement on my part. Again, there was no response, just silence. A week later, I received a notice in the mail from the county clerk's office. The HOA had placed a lien on my house for $680 in unpaid fees and fines. It was a clear act of aggression, a legal move designed to trap me. That's when I knew this was no longer a disagreement. This was a fight. A flicker of hope appeared in an unlikely place. My next-door neighbor, Joe Ritchie, was a quiet widower who mostly kept to himself. I'd see him in his garden sometimes, and we'd wave. That was the extent of our relationship. One afternoon, he saw me standing by my mailbox, staring at the lien notice. He walked over, a concerned look on his face. "Trouble with Delancey?" he asked. I just nodded, handing him the letter. He read it carefully, his brow furrowed. "I saw what she did at that meeting, Mike. It wasn't right." He handed the paper back to me. I used to be a federal prosecutor before I retired. This kind of paperwork, it's sloppy, but it's dangerous if you ignore it. Let me look into this for you. No charge. I was stunned. It was the first time in months I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this. I thanked him, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders for the first time in a long time. That same week, I had a commitment I couldn't break. I volunteered every year at a weekend-long event for a veteran support group a few hours away. I left on a Thursday morning feeling a little more optimistic. Joe was on the case. The truth would come out. It had to. I came back on Sunday afternoon. The first thing I noticed was the smoke, a faint chemical smell still hanging in the air. Then I saw it. Or, rather, I didn't see it. The trees that lined my driveway were there, but beyond them, there was just sky. Blue sky where the high A-frame of my house should have been. I pulled the truck to a stop and got out, my heart pounding a sick rhythm against my ribs. I walked the rest of the way up the driveway, a sense of dread so thick it felt like wading through water. The house was gone, completely. The ground was scraped clean, a flat black rectangle of scorched earth. They had even ripped out the dock, leaving splintered pilings sticking out of the water like broken teeth. There was a sign hammered into the ground near the ashes, a bright yellow plastic sign. It read, "This property has been reclaimed and abated by the Sterling Lake Homeowners Association by court order." It wasn't a fire, it was an erasure. They had brought in a crew, a sheriff for supervision, with what I'd later learn was a forged court order, and they had demolished it, burned it, and hauled it away. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the empty lot screaming in my ears. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. The time for that was over. I just turned around, walked past my truck, and went deep into the woods behind my property, the only thing they hadn't touched. I sat on a fallen log, the smell of pine and cold ash filling my lungs, and I made a promise to my wife, to the families who were supposed to find peace here, and to myself. I didn't go looking for a war, but they sure brought one to my doorstep. They lit the wrong fire. A fire can destroy, but it can also forge. It can reduce a home to ash, but it can harden a man's resolve into something unbreakable. I didn't rebuild the house, not yet. First, you clear the rubble and inspect the foundation. That's what I was doing, just not with wood and nails. I bought a used 20-foot travel trailer and parked it at the back of the property, tucked into the tree line where the main house couldn't be seen from the road. It was my command post. I ran a generator for power and used a hotspot for internet. I slept there, ate there, and worked there. The first thing I did was set up small, motion-activated trail cameras around the perimeter of my land. As an engineer, you learn to measure everything. As a soldier, you learn to watch your back. The community started to divide, slowly at first, then all at once. It was like a crack forming in ice. Some of the older residents, people who'd known my family for years, would stop by. One brought a casserole, another a bag of groceries. They'd stand by their car, shake their heads at the blackened patch of ground, and say things like, "This isn't right, Mike. What she did, it's not right." But Karen's people, mostly newer residents from her old real estate circle, were a different story. They'd drive by slowly, their windows rolled up, their faces set in a kind of smug disapproval. They saw my trailer not as a symbol of defiance, but as proof that Karen had been right all along. I was a squatter, an eyesore, bringing down their precious property values. That's when she sent her dog. He wasn't a real cop, though he dressed the part. His name was Brent Kolb, a private security guard with a utility belt full of gear and an ego full of hot air. He drove a white sedan with an orange light bar on top and HOA enforcement stenciled on the side. He started patrolling my driveway. The first time, he banged on the door of my trailer at 10 o'clock at night. "HOA security!" he boomed. "You're on private HOA property. You have 24 hours to vacate." I just looked at him through the small window, didn't open the door. The next morning, there was a bright orange sticker on my truck windshield, threatening to have it towed. He was there to intimidate, to make my life so miserable I'd just give up and leave. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Every visit, every warning, every late-night pass with his spotlight flashing across my trailer, it all got saved to a hard drive from my trail cam footage. While Kolb was busy playing make-believe cop, Joe and I were digging. We started by looking into Karen herself. Joe, with his quiet, methodical prosecutor's mind, started pulling public records, property sales, business filings, the works. A pattern started to emerge. In the 3 years since Karen Delancey had become HOA president, 5 longtime residents, all retirees on fixed incomes, had been forced to sell. The pattern was always the same: a sudden flood of petty violations, escalating fines, a lien, and then overwhelming legal pressure until they couldn't take it anymore. And in every single case, the buyer was a numbered LLC that traced back to a property management group specializing in short-term vacation rentals. Karen, the former realtor, was systematically hollowing out the neighborhood to turn it into a rental mill. My property, one of the largest on the lake, was the crown jewel. With me out of the way, she could have pushed the board to subdivide the lot. But she didn't just want the land, she wanted to make an example of me. She wanted everyone to see what happens when you defy her. That was her mistake. She lit a beacon. With Joe's help, I filed a formal request with the county for the full deed history and original plat maps for the entire Sterling Lake development, going back to its founding. A few weeks later, a thick manila envelope arrived. We spread the old, brittle maps across the small table in my trailer, and there it was, clear as day, on the original 1958 survey map. A thick black line marked the boundary of the land that would one day be incorporated into the HOA. My grandfather's property was on the other side of that line. Legally, my land was an island, completely outside their jurisdiction. Joe looked at me, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "She never even checked," he said. "She just assumed." But it wasn't the checkmate we needed. Not yet. The HOA had been acting like they had authority for so long, a judge might see it as an accepted fact if we couldn't prove malicious intent. We had the gun, but it wasn't smoking yet. Karen, drunk on her victory, gave us the final piece. She made a fatal error in judgment, the kind arrogant people always make. She filed a trespassing charge against me, a real one, with the county sheriff, for being on my own land. A court hearing was set. She thought she was going to have me hauled off in handcuffs, cementing her total power over the neighborhood. What she was really doing was stepping into a cage Joe and I had just finished building. The fight was no longer about bylaws and fines. It was about criminal charges, and that meant the rules of evidence were about to change. That evening, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Carla Baines, an investigative reporter for the local news channel. I'd seen her work, exposing corruption in small-town governments. I gave her the short version. "My name is Mike Holy. The HOA burned my house down over a fake bill, and now the president is trying to have me arrested for trespassing on the ashes." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, "I'll be there tomorrow at 9. The second call was to a buddy from my VFW post, Dave Morales. We called him Tank. He used to be a contract law specialist for the Department of Defense, a guy who could find a loophole in a sealed steel drum. Now he ran an RV repair shop. "Tank," I said, "I've got a weird one. I need to know everything there is to know about a shell LLC that went defunct about 10 years ago. He just laughed. "Mike, you know I live for this stuff. Send me what you got." Something big was coming. Karen thought she was planning my eviction. I was planning her annihilation. Power isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about owning the paper. While Karen was busy filing trespassing charges and sending her fake cop to harass me, Tank was in his element, digging through digital archives like a hog looking for truffles. He called me 3 days later, his voice crackling with excitement over his Bluetooth speaker. "Bingo, my friend, you're not going to believe this." It turns out the original company that developed Sterling Lake back in the 60s, Lakefront Properties, Inc., had gone belly up during the savings and loan crisis in the late 80s. They'd sold off the residential lots, but the common areas, the entrance, the clubhouse, the boat ramp were never formally transferred to the HOA. Instead, they were leased to the HOA for 99 years by a separate shell corporation the developers had set up for tax reasons. That shell LLC was called Sterling Services. And here was the kicker. Sterling Services LLC had been administratively dissolved by the state 10 years ago for failure to pay its franchise taxes. It was a ghost company, but a ghost with assets. The state had put its outstanding liabilities, including a $1,500 tax bill, up for collection. Nobody had ever bothered to buy them. "Mike," Tank said, his voice dropping an octave, "if you pay that $1,500, you don't just buy the debt. You buy the legal standing of the dissolved entity. You become the owner of Sterling Services, LLC." I felt a cold surge of adrenaline. It was so simple, so elegant. It was almost beautiful. The HOA didn't actually own the ground they stood on. They were tenants, and their landlord had just gone out of business. The next day, I drove to the state capitol. It took less than an hour at the Department of Revenue to pay the outstanding tax debt and file the paperwork to assume control of the dissolved LLC. For the price of a decent riding lawnmower, I now owned the company that held all the land rights and contract authority for every common area in the Sterling Lake development. This included the contract the HOA had with their landscapers, their trash collection, and, most importantly, their security patrol. The ink on the official state seal was still drying when I drove back to the lake. I printed 50 copies of the official transfer of ownership documents. Then, under the cover of darkness, I walked through the neighborhood. I posted a notice on the clubhouse door, the main entrance sign, and the community bulletin board. It was a simple one-page document. To Sterling Lake Homeowners Association Board, from Sterling Services, LLC. Effective immediately. Your contract for management and enforcement services over the common areas of this development is hereby terminated for cause. All HOA personnel and contractors, including private security patrols, are no longer authorized to access or operate on these properties. Trespassers will be prosecuted. I signed it, Mike Halley, Managing Member, Sterling Services, LLC. I saved one last notice for the fake cop. I waited until I saw his white sedan doing its nightly patrol, and as he passed my driveway, I walked out and taped the notice to his driver's side window. The look on his face when he got out of his car and read it under his flashlight was worth the $1,500 all by itself. The explosion came 24 hours later. A certified letter arrived from Karen's lawyer, a cease and desist dripping with legal threats. It called my actions tortious interference, fraudulent, and a blatant attempt to undermine the lawful authority of the board. It demanded I immediately retract my notices or face a lawsuit that would cost me everything I had left. They were trying to scare me. They were acting like a wounded animal, all teeth and noise. I took their letter and made another 50 copies. This time, I went back to every bulletin board and taped up the lawyer's letter, and underneath it, I added my own note, written in big black marker. It said, "They burned my house down. They filed a fake lien. They're trying to have me arrested for being on my own land. Now they are threatening to sue me for standing up to them. If anyone else in this neighborhood has lost money, lost peace of mind, or been bullied by this board, meet me at the county fire station on Tuesday at 6 p.m. It's time we talked." It was a gamble. I didn't know if anyone would show up. I was a man living in a trailer on a pile of ash. Why would they trust me? But I had a feeling Karen had pushed more people than just me. She had made the neighborhood quiet, but it was the quiet of fear, not of contentment. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to shout in the silence to remind everyone else they still have a voice. On Tuesday evening, I drove to the fire station, not knowing what to expect. 5 people? 10? The meeting room was a big open space where they held pancake breakfasts. When I walked in, my heart nearly stopped. Every single chair was full, and people were standing along the walls. There must have been close to 100 residents there, their faces a mixture of anger, hope, and exhaustion. They had come. All of them. Walking into that fire station felt like stepping into a pressure cooker. The air was thick with a frustrated energy, a mix of anger and hope. These weren't troublemakers, they were my neighbors. Veterans in VFW caps, retired linemen with worn-out boots, widows who had lived here for 40 years. These were the people who formed the bedrock of the community, and their faces told stories of 1,000 small cuts. I stood at the front of the room, behind a simple folding table. I didn't have a microphone or a presentation. I just had my story. I told them everything, from the first notice about the dock to the ashes of my home to the company I now owned. I laid out the documents on the table for anyone to see, the plat map, the ownership transfer, the termination notice. When I finished, the room was dead silent. Then, a man in the back stood up. His name was Frank, a retired electrician who'd lived 2 streets over since the neighborhood was built. "She got me too," he said, his voice raspy. Fined me $200 because the paint on my mailbox was faded. Said I had 30 days to repaint it to an approved shade of black. I'm 82 years old, Mike. I can't be climbing around painting a mailbox. Another voice, a woman named Maria, piped up from the side. They put a lien on my house because my son's pickup truck was parked in my driveway for 2 days while he was visiting from the Army. Said it was a commercial vehicle. It's a Ford F-150. The dam broke. For the next hour, person after person stood up and shared their story. It was a torrent of petty tyrannies, fines for leaving garbage cans out 2 hours too long, citations for cracks in a driveway, demands to remove bird feeders. A former board member, a quiet woman who had resigned a year ago, stood up, her hands trembling. She doctored the minutes, she confessed. We'd vote something down, and she'd record it as tabled for further discussion. Then she'd just do what she wanted and claim the board approved it. A man who had worked for the county permit office for 30 years before retiring added his piece. The lien forms she's using, they're old county stock. They haven't been valid for years. And the signature's on the demolition order for your place, Mike. I know the clerk's signature. That's not it. It was fraud. All of it. From top to bottom, it was a racket built on forged documents, intimidation, and the assumption that nobody would ever fight back. Someone in the crowd shouted, "We should file a class action lawsuit." An excited murmur went through the room. "Not yet," I said, holding up a hand. The room quieted down. A lawsuit is a battlefield. Before you fight a battle, you have to choose your ground. Our ground is next week's HOA meeting. A wave of groans went through the room. They had all been to those meetings. They knew they were a sham. This time will be different, I promised. This time, we all go. We don't yell, we don't argue, we just vote. The energy in the room shifted. It was no longer just about anger, it was about purpose. A new chant started, low at first, then growing louder. Vote them out, vote them out. The night of the HOA meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Karen and her board arrived late, walking in with a smug confidence that faltered the second they saw the crowd. Every seat was taken, and residents were lined up 3 deep along the back wall. They looked like a king, and his court arriving to find the castle had been occupied by the peasants. Karen tried to control the room, banging her gavel and demanding order, but the atmosphere was electric. She didn't have the floor anymore. When the open comments section of the agenda came up, I walked to the front. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed a stack of papers on the table in front of her. "Karen," I said, my voice carrying easily in the silent room, "this is a copy of the Articles of Incorporation for Sterling Services LLC, confirming my ownership." I placed a second document on top of it. "This is the original land lease agreement between Sterling Services and the Sterling Lake HOA." A third. "And this is the official notice of termination of that lease." Her face, which had been a mask of condescending authority, began to crumble. Her eyes darted from the papers to the faces in the crowd and back again. She was speechless. For the first time, Karen Delancey had lost control. She finally found her voice, sputtering. "This is illegal! You can't do this! I'll sue you! I'll sue everyone in this room!" She was frantic, her power slipping through her fingers like sand. I just let her tirade burn itself out. When she was finished, panting and red-faced, I looked her right in the eye. "You can't sue us, Karen," I said calmly, "because you're not a legitimate board. You're a racket." I then held up one final document, my voice steady and clear. "This is a copy of a formal complaint, filed this morning with the State Attorney General's office, outlining allegations of fraud, racketeering, and malicious destruction of property. It's signed by me and 78 other homeowners." The room erupted. Karen looked like she had been punched in the gut. The game was over. The trap had been sprung, and she had walked right into the middle of it. Karen Delancey's last move was a desperate one. Cornered and publicly humiliated, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She tried to bully her way out with lawyers. She filed a lawsuit against me for defamation, claiming I had damaged her reputation and caused her emotional distress. It was a classic bully tactic, designed to bury me in legal fees and silence me through intimidation. It backfired on her in the most spectacular way possible. Her lawsuit triggered the legal discovery process, which meant her lawyers and my lawyer, Joe, had the right to demand access to all relevant documents. By suing me, she had voluntarily handed us the keys to her kingdom. She had opened the door, and Joe walked right in. We didn't just get a few meeting minutes. We got everything. Every email, every text message, and most importantly, every single financial record for the Sterling Lake HOA going back 5 years. The board's insurance company, seeing the mountain of evidence stacking up from the Attorney General's investigation and our own discovery requests, took one look at the situation and dropped the HOA like a hot rock. Suddenly, Karen and her cronies were on their own, personally liable for their legal fees. That's when we filed our counterclaim: arson, fraud, malicious abuse of process, and destruction of private property. The game had officially changed. My original court date, the one for the trespassing charge she had filed against me, was finally here. But the trespassing charge had been dropped by the county prosecutor weeks ago. The courtroom wasn't for me anymore. It was for her. The day of the trial was crisp and clear. I walked into the courthouse with Joe beside me. I was wearing a simple blazer and slacks, holding a single thick binder. I wasn't nervous. I was just ready. A few minutes later, Karen swept in, flanked by her expensive lawyer. She was wearing a bright red power suit, her face a mask of defiant confidence, like she was walking onto a stage. She didn't look at me, but I could feel her looking. She was trying to project power, but all I saw was desperation. My lawyer, my quiet neighbor Joe, just gave me a small nod. He looked like what he was, a retired guy who enjoyed gardening. He carried a worn leather briefcase and had a calm, almost sleepy demeanor. Karen and her lawyer had no idea they were about to be cross-examined by a man who had put mafia bosses in federal prison. The trial began, and it was methodical. Joe wasn't flashy. He just laid out the facts one by one, like a bricklayer building a wall. He called the county clerk to the stand, who testified that the court order used to authorize the demolition of my house was a forgery. The signature was fake, the case number didn't exist, and the stamp was from a model that hadn't been used in her office for over a decade. He called the former HOA board member to the stand, who testified under oath that Karen had repeatedly altered meeting minutes and pushed through expenditures without board approval. Then it was the treasurer's turn. Ann Folis, the woman who signed whatever Karen put in front of her. She got on the stand, clutching a tissue, her face pale. Joe was gentle with her, his voice soft and reassuring. He walked her through the financial statements, pointing out check after check, written to a company called Lakefront Maintenance Solutions. He asked her if she had ever solicited bids for the work. She admitted she hadn't. Karen had told her it wasn't necessary. He then produced incorporation documents for Lakefront Maintenance Solutions. The sole owner was listed as Daniel Delancey, Karen's husband. The contracts were for basic landscaping work, but the invoices were for tens of thousands of dollars more than any other company would charge. Kickbacks, plain and simple. The final piece was the demolition contract itself. Joe presented the document to Karen on the witness stand. "Is this your signature, Mrs. Delancey, authorizing the payment of $50,000 to the demolition company?" he asked. She looked at it, her confidence finally cracking. "Yes," she whispered. "And this is your signature on the abatement order presented to the sheriff, correct?" He placed the forged court order in front of her. Her lawyer shot up, shouting, "Objection!" But it was too late. Everyone in the courtroom had seen it. The signatures were identical. She had signed the fake document that condemned my home to dust. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, had heard enough. She banged her gavel once, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom. "The court will take a recess," she announced, her voice like ice. "Will the bailiffs please escort Mrs. Delancey to my chambers?" 2 uniformed police officers who had been standing quietly at the back of the courtroom walked forward. They didn't put handcuffs on her, not yet. They just flanked her, one on each side, and gently but firmly guided her out of the witness box and toward a side door. As she passed my table, her eyes met mine for just a fraction of a second. The defiance was gone. All that was left was the raw, naked look of absolute defeat. Guess whose courtroom it is now? The legal system, for all its flaws, can sometimes move with the swift, clean force of a guillotine. Karen Delancey's case was over before it truly began. After she was led from the courtroom, the state attorney general's office took over. With the forged documents, the trail of financial fraud, and the testimony of more than a dozen residents, her fate was sealed. She pleaded guilty to a slate of charges: fraud, racketeering, and malicious destruction of property, hoping for a lighter sentence. The judge wasn't moved. At her sentencing, she stood before the court in a drab pantsuit, the power suit and the arrogant smirk long gone. I was there, sitting in the back row with Joe. I didn't go for revenge. I went to see it through to the end. The judge ordered her to pay full restitution for the value of my home and all my legal fees. Then he looked at her over the top of his glasses and sentenced her to 5 years in state prison. No parole for the first 2. A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. It was real, actual consequences. Her co-conspirators on the board didn't go to prison, but their lives were ruined in a different way. They were all named in the class action lawsuit, filed by Joe on behalf of the 78 families from our meeting. They settled quickly. The HOA's remaining funds were drained, and each of the board members had to pay out of their own pockets. Ann Folis, the timid treasurer, lost her house. The others paid tens of thousands. They were broken, financially and socially. Nobody would even look at them in the grocery store anymore. They had traded their integrity for a little bit of borrowed power, and the bill had finally come due. With the restitution money, I finally started to rebuild. It wasn't just a house this time. It was a promise. I hired a local contractor, a veteran-owned company, and we used the original blueprint Sarah and I had drawn up all those years ago. Neighbors I barely knew started showing up on weekends. Frank, the retired electrician, wired the whole house for free. A crew of younger guys from the VFW post helped frame the walls. The women in the neighborhood organized a rotation, bringing coffee and sandwiches every single day. They weren't just helping me build a house. They were helping reclaim a piece of the community that had been stolen by fear and suspicion. 6 months later, it was finished. We didn't call it my house. We called it by its proper name, the Haven House. It stood on the exact same spot, the new wood smelling of pine and promise, not of smoke and ash. Inside, a small, simple plaque was hung over the fireplace. It just said, "For Sarah, welcome home." The week we opened, the first Gold Star family arrived, a young Marine widow and her 2 small children. Seeing her kids run down to the newly rebuilt dock, laughing and skipping stones on the water, felt like the first clean breath I had taken in 2 years. Carla Baines, the reporter, came back to do a follow-up story. Her first piece had blown the story wide open, and now she wanted to show the ending. She filmed the new house, interviewed the neighbors, and talked to Joe about the legal battle. Her segment aired on the evening news, titled, "From Ashes to Answers, The Lake House That Burned and the Man Who Fought Back." It wasn't about me. It was about what was possible when ordinary people refused to be bullied. The Sterling Lake Homeowners Association was officially and permanently dissolved by a unanimous vote of the residents. Nobody wanted another board, another Karen, another set of rules designed to give one person power over another. Instead, we formed a simple volunteer council. We meet once a month at the fire station. There are no fines, no violations, no enforcement patrols. We just manage a shared budget for mowing the entrance and plowing the snow. If a neighbor's tree falls, we don't send a letter. We grab our chainsaws and help them cut it up. We started acting like neighbors again, not like suspects. The fear was gone, and in its place something much stronger had grown. I still live in my trailer, parked in the woods behind the Haven House. I like the quiet. I act as a caretaker for the property, making sure the families who visit have everything they need. Sometimes I sit on the new porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the lake, and I think about the last 2 years. They tried to take my peace, my home, my name. They tried to erase a lifetime of memories and turn it all to ash. But I had something they never did: neighbors, memory, and time. And in the end, I didn't just win. We all did.